Good afternoon, everyone. Canada now investigates climate denial. Your free thought, your free opinion about how our climate works, and if you don't believe in CO2, is now an investigation criminally in Canada. It stems from these billboards that Friends of Science put up talking about the pause, the hiatus in global warming, and also that CO2 is not the main driver of our climate system, that the sun is. And what heresy. You think we would be back in the Inquisitions sponsored by the Catholic Church? But this is EcoJustice and their minions in the Canadian government saying that it's a false claim that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Hey, eco-fascists, carbon dioxide is produced by every living thing on this planet. And even when you talk, it's 40,000 parts per million as you exhale your breath. Pope Francis, those who do not understand human activity causes in the climate should consult scientists. Thanks, Pope. Let's do that. Warm phase in the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation means more hurricanes. Warm water, more hurricanes. That's not very scientific. Drops in temperature that rebound naturally of over 2°C throughout the last 2,500 years. No, that's not very scientific either. It's all CO2. Remember all those factories and cars driving it, 2,000 years ago? They were just polluting away. Let's talk science. Every time there's a grand solar minimum, there's more galactic cosmic rays. And these galactic cosmic rays increase cloud cover, causing more ferocious storms and heavier rains. And the advertising standards of Canada, well, they have their own set of rules. And the sun is the main driver of the climate is not one of them. You are banned. And please join me for episode number 34 of Mini Ice Age Conversations, where Sam Corey, opinion author for The Nation in Bangkok, and I discuss how governments will handle grand solar minimum effects. And while you're watching the channel, please remember to subscribe to Adapt 2030 and click that bell so you can stay subscribed to get the latest updates. Canadian government now investigating climate denial. So if you think that the sun is the main driver or a large driver in our climate system, and you and your organization talk about such thing, you will be investigated as a criminal investigation through the Canadian government now. And they have spent taxpayer money investigating 3 of these organizations that deny mainstream climate science, but actually hold up real science, following a complaint from an environmental group. The signs that were put around Montreal in both French and English talk about the hiatus, the pause in global warming, and why it's not happening. To do your own research, try to find out why it has naturally stopped. And that CO2 is not the main driver of climate on the planet. That CO2 actually follows temperature. Well, EcoJustice just didn't like this because they had 96 complaints out of the whole city, Montreal. Oh, 96 complaints. The complaint was filed by EcoJustice on behalf of their parroting, subservient Canadian government employees. Well, except for UN Ambassador Stephen Lewis, who's an appointed position because there's never any elections in a global government. The Canadian government has been investigating Friends of Science, International Climate Science Coalition, and the Heartland Institute for making misleading claims about climate change, including that the sun is the main driver of our climate, not carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Now, please notice that EcoJustice and their 6 minions in the Canadian government claim that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Let me bring you some real science, eco-fascists and your lackeys that you tow behind in the Canadian government. CO2, all living things produce carbon dioxide. And as you spout the false narrative of carbon dioxide driving our climate system on the Earth, which it does not, you are putting out at the very minimum 40,000 parts per million as you spew your nonsense. That's not 400 parts per million, which you're squawking about at the moment. That is 40,000 parts per million. And you're trying to get them to label carbon dioxide as a pollutant? You're saying that every single thing on this planet is now a polluting vehicle. So back to the billboards. The sun is the main driver of climate change, not you, not CO2. I'll agree. Please come and sue me, Canadian government. I guess you want to take away my rights, my free speech to talk about science. And then even Pope Francis chimes in Those who doubt human activity causes climate change should consult with scientists. Well, actually, Pope, since the Catholic Church has been marching around our planet for the last 500 years, pillaging culture after culture, raiding the storehouses of libraries, steles, maps, codices that you all have in your secret library down in the Vatican that we are not able to even look with supervision through a glass wall at these documents. You know exactly what's happening with the climate system, yet you come in with, you need to talk to a scientist. Okay, let's do that. 180 years here of Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. Now, when it peaks, it's called the warm phase. And when we get into these warm phases, such as the 1930s, 1940s, and late 1800s, and where we are now again, it's a cycle. We get increased hurricane activity. And I love it. This is so 2017 societal snowflake mentality. The environmental groups are so up in arms, and they're in a bunch right now because of the 7th most powerful hurricane to make landfall. This is just like getting a participation trophy. 7th. And they're giving it so much credence. 7th. I wonder what will happen next year when it's 8th. So when you look at the variance in climate, and when you look at the AMO going into its cool phase and its warm phase, you notice when it's cool, the hurricane seasons are minimal because cooler water means less fuel for the storms. Yet somehow it's magically CO2 and it's magically us, the humans, driving all this system here. I mean, how many humans does it take to start a typhoon? I don't know. What's the ratio on that? Like, how many humans does it take to create a typhoon or a hurricane? And they keep saying this is so unusual. It's so unheard of. It's the first time ever the 7th most powerful hurricane to make landfall. Well, let's go back to 2010. They're even the exact same letter classifications for the storms, just a week apart. I don't think that's a cycle. No, that couldn't be. But let's talk about longer term cycles, because 10 years is nothing. 40 years is nothing, but the whole IPCC and the whole Al Gore crew and the whole environmental movement based around CO2 is only based on 40 years of satellite data. But they forget to conveniently leave out the rest of the picture. So let's bring it in, because I think it's kind of relevant right now. Eco-fascists running around saying you're not allowed to have an opinion about what drives the climate. Let's go back around 535. This is called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. And you notice that drop in temperature. Well, that was during a grand solar minimum, the first one that caused some volcanic eruptions. Now, there's a correlated link, published research between grand solar minimums and volcanic activity. For some reason, there is a direct correlation, and it is from the sun. Decreased magnetosphere, decreased solar winds, decreased magnetism on our planet, whatever it is, it causes the volcanoes to erupt. And you'll notice, 536, we had the eruption, and then what? Temperature rebounded naturally. Wait a second. There must have been a lot of cars and CO2 coming around that point to make the temperature go up so fast. Then we had another drop off in temperature, 541. Then the temperature rebounded over the next 15 years, 2C. Oh my gosh. How many factories were churning out stuff back then to make the temperature rise so quickly? We need regulation. We need to shut everybody up. They're not allowed to talk about alternative sources of climate driver. Might give somebody the truth, and then we won't be able to tax the world. Shh. Let's continue with 1258, 1452. Wait a second, the temperature's rebounded. I'm not talking about the red spikes that were volcanic-induced cooling that rebounded after the ash came out of the air and the sulfur dioxide diminished. I'm talking about the trend in temperature going up and down naturally. Oh, you couldn't see the forest through the trees on that one, huh? Let's take this back 2,500 years. Eco-fascists always tell you, Canadian government minions as well, that this chart won't exist in time because, you know, CO2 is a pollutant and the sun does not drive our climate. This is the first time it's ever been this warm. So Canadian government, you might want to look at this chart here and get yourself not looking so bad in the public eyes, because the statements that you're making, investigating people that have this true science, make you look incredibly incompetent. You're saying that it was never this warm before. Let's just go back and I'll let the chart. Left side, right and left Canadian government. You can function at that level so you know where right and left are, yes? Okay, good. Left side. I can't believe you'd be that incompetent to actually investigate people. Truly unbelievable. Let's take a little bit deeper look at the late antique little ice age. So the Wei dynasty was wiped out during this time, as every grand solar minimum wipes out Chinese dynasties. But then we have this very specific drop in temperature down 2 degrees C, and then over the next 140 years it rises back up 2 C. Without factories, without cars, without big cities. What do you think could have done that? And then we take a look at the last 1,000 years of temperature, and you see all those things, they're ups and downs. Okay, Canadian government and EcoJustice, eco-fascists, you know the terms up and down. Your cognitive abilities are discernible enough to understand up and down. Is that correct? Okay, good. Up means warmer temperature, down means cooler temperature. Like I said you knew right and left. So right side is current time frame, left side is back in the past. So now that we discern that you know 4 words at least before you can start another investigation, let's look here. How does this temperature go up and down through history and time without all the factories and CO2? Please explain that to me. And the Advertising Standards of Canada. Okay, I understand it's an independent bureau that's non-government affiliated, but they have their own set of rules, which is what's acceptable in advertising, basically. So sex and alcohol, perfectly acceptable. But when you talk about the sun being the main driver of the climate, that's out of bounds. Talking about the sun is out of bounds, but able to sell alcohol, sex, transportation on airlines which fly in the sky on holidays, which produce more CO2, selling of furniture, which means cutting the forest and then putting them into a factory, which creates more CO2 so you can buy the product, then have it shipped through a CO2 polluting vehicle. That's all okay for the advertisers. Cool. But when you talk about the climate being driven by the sun, that's not cool. That's out of bounds. And cool is exactly where we're going. Global cooling. Somehow they just don't get the correlation that when we go into low solar activity, our Earth's climate cools, and when we come into high solar activity, the Earth's climate warms. The charts are so discernible and so in your face, I just don't know how they can't see this. I mean, a kindergartner literally could notice this. Literally. That's what's so disturbing, that these people actually have power in the Canadian government. And then we look at the ebbs and flows of energy from our sun. Modern minimum, little energy coming out of the sun. Very few sunspots. You notice how cold it was back then? And then we have a lot of sunspots now, so now it's even warmer. So I'm just trying to explain this like I would explain to a kindergartner for the Canadian government. This is sad. Also, notice how heat and cooling periods alternate from different parts of the planet through history, especially when we go back 2,000 years. And this is using a number of proxies and variables, from tree rings to lake core sediment drilling, pollen counts, you got the stalactites, offshore in the ocean sediments as well. You got the ice cores. There's a whole bunch of different things that we're looking at and coming to the same conclusion, that temperature varies over time, and also by the region on the planet. So if you really look at this and you still believe that CO2 is the main driver for everything, I just don't know where the CO2 concentrations would have come from 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, when these temperatures changed, warming and cooling naturally. And science again showing galactic cosmic rays increasing. There'll be a 19% increase over the next solar cycle. And as always, proven science, when the solar cycle is low in its activity phase, which we're going into an even lower phase than solar cycle 24, the galactic cosmic rays increase. It's an inverse relationship. So the magnetosphere is not as strong, so these galactic cosmic rays are able to penetrate the atmosphere. They cause more cloud cover. In solar cycle 24, 25, 26, more cloud cover because of higher cosmic ray intensity. So again, I'll bring it back to the billboard. The sun is the main driver of our climate system and climate change on this planet. It is not you. It is not CO2. And I think actually the persons in the Canadian government who are investigating Friends of Climate Science need to be investigating themselves for misappropriation of funds. And with the private organization Advertising Standards Canada, they're still upholding the ban on talking about the sun being the main driver of the climate. Thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of the video.